The light rain slid down the pristine windows of the Cha mansion, nestled in one of Seoul's most luxurious neighborhoods. Outside, the perfectly manicured gardens reflected the golden glow of the morning sun, still veiled in mist. Inside, however, the atmosphere was heavy and almost suffocating. Cha Eun-Woo, heir to the Cha Hotel's conglomerate, sat in his office. Tall and impeccably groomed, he wore a dark gray suit tailored to perfection, emphasizing his broad shoulders and aristocratic profile. His neatly combed-back black hair revealed sharp, chiseled features. His intense, dark eyes fixated on the tablet in front of him as he read the same merger proposal for the third time. Yet, his mind was far away, weighed down by the recent upheaval in his life. Since the tragic death of his older brother and sister-in-law, Eun-Woo had barely slept. In addition to managing the family empire, he was now tasked with caring for Ji-Hoon, his 5-year-old nephew. The thought of the boy, who cried every night for his parents, tied his stomach into knots. "Mr. Cha, the candidates are here for the interview," his assistant announced, interrupting his thoughts. Her voice was formal, but there was an undertone of urgency. Eun-Woo exhaled deeply and stood, adjusting his suit. "Send in the next one," he replied curtly, bracing himself for yet another round of potential nannies, none of whom had met his high standards so far. In the living room, Kang Ji-Min waited nervously. Petite, with long, wavy brown hair cascading naturally over her shoulders, she looked out of place in the opulent mansion. Her simple white blouse and black skirt highlighted the softness of her features. Her large, expressive eyes scanned the surroundings with a mix of fascination and anxiety. "You can do this, Ji-Min," she whispered to herself, clenching her sweaty hands in her lap. This was more than just an interview for her. It was a chance to start over. After losing her parents in a tragic accident, Ji-Min had dedicated her life to caring for children. It was her way of filling the void in her heart. "Miss Kang Ji-Min?" The assistant reappeared, and Ji-Min stood immediately, taking a deep breath before entering the office. The moment she walked in, Ji-Min felt the weight of Eun-Woo's presence. He stood, hands in his pockets, his posture firm like a statue. His piercing gaze swept over her from head to toe. "Do you have experience with children?" he asked without preamble. "Yes, sir," Ji-Min replied, trying to keep her composure. "I worked as a nanny at a community daycare for the past 3 years." "Community?" Eun-Woo raised an eyebrow, his voice tinged with skepticism. Ji-Min swallowed hard, feeling the tension in the air. "Yes. It's where I learned to handle children in emotionally traumatic situations." For a moment, Eun-Woo hesitated. He knew Ji-Hoon needed someone like that, but something about her unsettled him. Perhaps it was the light in her eyes, radiating a kindness he couldn't comprehend. "And why do you think you're capable of caring for a child in such a complex situation?" His question came with a gaze that seemed to pierce her soul. Ji-Min straightened, her soft expression now resolute. "Because I also lost my parents at a young age. I know what that emptiness feels like, and I know how to fill it with love and patience." Her answer caught Eun-Woo off guard. For a brief moment, his hardened gaze softened, but he quickly regained control. "Very well. You start tomorrow. Don't disappoint me." Outside the mansion, Ji-Min let out a sigh of relief, though her thoughts raced. She knew there was more beneath Eun-Woo's rigid facade, and she was curious to uncover it. Inside, Eun-Woo stared out the window at the cloudy sky. He didn't know what to expect from this woman, but something in her words had touched him, even if he didn't want to admit it. And so, their lives were about to change forever, bound together by necessity and the unseen threads of fate. The next morning began with the faint sound of soft footsteps echoing against the marble floors of the Cha mansion. Ji-Min, dressed in a simple white shirt and a pair of neatly pressed jeans, carried a modest backpack filled with tools to entertain Ji-Hoon. She took a deep breath as she gazed at the grand structure before her, reminding herself once more of the opportunity she couldn't afford to waste. When the door opened, it was Cha Eun-Woo who stood there, impeccably dressed in a navy blue suit that seemed to amplify his already commanding presence. His sharp eyes immediately scanned Ji-Min, taking in her casual appearance. "You're late," he said flatly, glancing at his watch. Ji-Min forced a polite smile. "I apologize. The traffic was heavier than I expected." "Next time, leave earlier," he replied coldly, stepping aside to let her in. She bit her tongue, suppressing the urge to retort. Instead, she reminded herself of why she was there and quietly followed him inside. Ji-Hoon sat in the playroom, cradling a stuffed bunny in his small hands. His round cheeks and innocent expression would have melted anyone's heart, but the sorrow in his eyes was impossible to miss. Ji-Min knelt beside him, her movements gentle and deliberate. "Hi, Ji-Hoon," she said softly, offering him a warm smile. "I'm Ji-Min. I'll be taking care of you from now on." The little boy didn't respond, clutching his bunny tighter as he avoided her gaze. Ji-Min reached into her backpack and pulled out a set of crayons and a sketch pad. "Do you like drawing?" she asked, placing the items in front of him. Ji-Hoon hesitated, his eyes flickering toward the crayons. After a moment, he picked up a blue one and began to draw silently. Ji-Min sat beside him, quietly matching his pace, letting him take the lead. From the doorway, Eun-Woo observed the scene with crossed arms, his expression unreadable. He watched Ji-Min's gentle approach and the way Ji-Hoon seemed to relax in her presence, though his skepticism lingered. "You think this will work?" The voice of CEO Hye-ri interrupted his thoughts as she walked into the room. Clad in a bold red blazer, she exuded confidence as she surveyed the playroom. Eun-Woo turned toward her, his face neutral. "She's capable." Hye-ri raised an eyebrow, glancing toward Ji-Min. "Capable, perhaps, but hardly the type to handle our family's standards." "She's here for Ji-Hoon," Eun-Woo replied curtly, cutting off any further commentary. His tone left no room for argument, though his own doubts still lingered. Later that afternoon, Ji-Min suggested taking Ji-Hoon to a nearby playground. The boy hesitated at first, but eventually agreed after some coaxing. The playground was lively, filled with children's laughter and the occasional squeak of swings. Ji-Min knelt beside Ji-Hoon, holding his small hand as they approached a colorful slide. "Want to give it a try?" she asked, her tone encouraging. Ji-Hoon shook his head, clutching her hand tighter. Ji-Min smiled gently, sitting down on a nearby swing with him. "That's okay. We can just sit and watch for now." Her patience seemed to calm him. Slowly, Ji-Hoon began to look around, his curiosity sparking as he watched other children play. When a playful puppy darted across the playground chasing a ball, he giggled softly. Eun-Woo arrived at the playground unexpectedly. He stood at a distance, his hands in his pockets, observing Ji-Min and Ji-Hoon. He wasn't sure why he had come. Maybe it was guilt for not spending enough time with his nephew. Or maybe it was something else entirely. Something about Ji-Min that intrigued him in ways he couldn't quite define. Suddenly, Ji-Min slipped while trying to catch Ji-Hoon as he ran toward the slide. She landed awkwardly on the grass, letting out a surprised yelp before laughing at herself. Ji-Hoon burst into laughter, pointing at her with glee. "Oh, now you think it's funny?" Ji-Min teased, brushing dirt off her jeans. Eun-Woo was at her side in moments, his brow furrowed with concern. "Are you all right?" he asked, his tone unusually soft. Ji-Min looked up at him, startled by the change in his demeanor. "I'm fine. Just a little grass stain," she said, chuckling lightly. For a fleeting moment, their eyes met, and Ji-Min felt the air shift between them. Eun-Woo quickly cleared his throat, looking away. "Be more careful next time," he muttered before stepping back. By the time they returned to the mansion, Ji-Hoon was visibly more cheerful, holding Ji-Min's hand tightly as they walked up the stairs. She felt a flicker of hope as she tucked him in for the night, knowing she had begun to break through the walls around his heart. Eun-Woo, on the other hand, found himself in his study, staring out at the city lights. His thoughts kept drifting back to Ji-Min. There was something about her, the way she interacted with Ji-Hoon, the way she carried herself, that he couldn't ignore. Perhaps, he thought, not everything had to be as cold and controlled as he once believed. Night had fallen over Seoul, and the steady rhythm of rain against the windows filled the Cha mansion with a tranquil, almost melancholic ambiance. Ji-Min was seated beside Ji-Hoon's bed, reading to him from a colorful storybook. Her voice was soft and soothing, creating an atmosphere of comfort. Ji-Hoon clutched his stuffed bunny tightly, his wide eyes focused on the illustrations as Ji-Min turned each page. She smiled at his growing interest, her heart warming at the small progress. And then the little bunny found a cozy place to sleep, surrounded by a family that cared deeply for him, she finished, closing the book with care. Ji-Hoon looked up at her, his voice barely above a whisper. "Will you stay here tomorrow?" Ji-Min's smile softened. She adjusted the blanket around him and brushed a stray lock of hair from his forehead. "Of course, I promise." After Ji-Hoon drifted to sleep, Ji-Min left the room quietly. The hallway was dimly lit, and the faint sound of rain accompanied her as she descended the grand staircase. She planned to make herself a cup of tea before retreating to her own room for the night. Passing the living room, she spotted Eun-Woo standing by the large window. He was silhouetted against the glass, hands in his pockets, his gaze fixed on the storm outside. His shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, his sleeves rolled up, a rare, unguarded look for him. Ji-Min hesitated, unsure if she should interrupt. "You often wander the house at night?" His voice broke the silence, calm yet curious. Caught off guard, Ji-Min smiled nervously. "I was heading to the kitchen. I didn't mean to disturb you." "You're not disturbing me," he replied, still staring at the rain. After a moment, he turned to face her. His eyes held a softness she hadn't seen before. "How is he?" he asked, referring to Ji-Hoon. "Asleep," she answered, folding her hands in front of her. "He's a strong boy, but healing takes time." Eun-Woo nodded, his gaze thoughtful. "I never imagined I'd be in this position. Caring for a child, it doesn't come naturally to me." Ji-Min stepped closer, her voice gentle. "Children don't need perfection. They just need someone who's there for them. And I think you're doing more than you realize." For a brief moment, Eun-Woo studied her, his intense gaze almost unnerving. "You speak as if you've been through a lot yourself," he said, his voice quieter now. Ji-Min hesitated, looking down at the hem of her sweater. "I lost my parents when I was young. It was hard, but there are always good people who step in to help." Eun-Woo's expression shifted, as though her words stirred something inside him. Before he could respond, the lights flickered and went out completely, plunging the room into darkness. Ji-Min gasped, startled by the sudden blackout. She instinctively reached out to steady herself. "It's just a power outage," Eun-Woo said calmly, pulling out his phone to use its flashlight. "Are you all right?" "Yes," she replied, her voice shaky. "Just didn't expect it." "Let's go to the kitchen. There are candles there," he suggested, his tone now laced with reassurance. In the kitchen, Eun-Woo retrieved a box of candles from a cabinet and lit one with the efficiency of someone who never left things to chance. The warm glow bathed the room in a soft, flickering light. "There," he said, placing the candle on the marble countertop. Ji-Min watched him in silence, surprised by how natural he seemed in such a simple task. A soft laugh escaped her lips. "What's funny?" he asked, his brow furrowing slightly. "Nothing," she said, shaking her head. "I just didn't picture you lighting candles in a kitchen. You always seem so serious." He narrowed his eyes at her, though the hint of a smile tugged at the corners of his lips. "Careful, Kang Ji-Min." You still work for me." "Yes, sir," she teased, suppressing another laugh. The rain continued outside, filling the silence that followed. They stood on opposite sides of the counter, the candlelight casting gentle shadows across their faces. Ji-Min, feeling emboldened by the moment, decided to ask, "Why do you keep people at a distance?" Eun-Woo hesitated before answering. "My family taught me that vulnerability is a weakness. My grandfather, he never tolerated mistakes." "That doesn't seem fair," she said, frowning slightly. "People don't need to be perfect, especially with those they love." Her words seemed to strike a chord. Eun-Woo looked down at his hands, his usual composure faltering slightly. He reached for a glass of water, more to occupy himself than anything else. "You seem comfortable giving advice," he said, his tone teasing but thoughtful. Ji-Min smiled. "I just say what I think. Someone has to. Don't you agree?" For the first time, Eun-Woo chuckled. The sound was brief but warm, catching Ji-Min off guard. She found herself smiling back, feeling the walls between them begin to crumble, even if just a little. When the power returned, the moment broke. Eun-Woo straightened, returning to his usual reserved demeanor. "Good night, Mr. Cha," Ji-Min said, heading toward the stairs. "Good night," he replied, watching her disappear down the hall. That night, for the first time in years, Eun-Woo felt a sliver of hope. Perhaps, he thought, he wasn't as alone as he had convinced himself to be. Morning light filtered into the Cha mansion, casting long shadows across the polished floors of Eun-Woo's office. He sat at his desk, his jaw tight and his eyes dark as he stared at his phone. Oh Byung-chul's commanding voice crackled on the other end of the line, sharp and unyielding. "You have no choice, Eun-Woo," the elder Cha said coldly. "Marrying Hee-ri will secure our family's position in the market. This alliance is non-negotiable." Eun-Woo's grip on the phone tightened. The pressure of his family's expectations had always been heavy, but this demand felt unbearable. "I won't marry for convenience," he replied, his tone steady but laced with defiance. "If you want to retain custody of Ji-Hoon, you will do as I say," Byung-chul countered, his voice icy. "The decision is yours." Silence followed, heavy and suffocating. Eun-Woo knew his grandfather was ruthless, capable of using Ji-Hoon as leverage to manipulate him. Meanwhile, Ji-Min sat on the living room floor, helping Ji-Hoon assemble a puzzle of cartoon animals. The little boy giggled as he tried to fit the pieces together, his laughter a welcome reprieve from the weight of the mansion's oppressive atmosphere. "Ji-Min," Eun-Woo's voice interrupted, firm and unyielding. He stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable. She looked up, surprised by his tone. "Yes, Mr. Cha?" "Come with me," he said, already turning toward the hallway. Confused but curious, Ji-Min rose to her feet, instructing Ji-Hoon to continue playing. She followed Eun-Woo to the library, the air thick with tension as he closed the door behind them. "I need your help," Eun-Woo began abruptly, his eyes locking onto hers. Ji-Min blinked, taken aback by the uncharacteristic vulnerability in his voice. "Of course. What is it?" "My grandfather is demanding that I marry Seo Hee-ri," he said, his words clipped and precise. "He claims it's the only way to secure our family's future and ensure I keep custody of Ji-Hoon. But I refuse to marry her." Ji-Min frowned, unsure of where this was leading. "That's a lot of pressure. But how can I help?" Eun-Woo hesitated for a moment before stepping closer. "I need you to pretend to be my fiancé, just for a while, long enough to convince my grandfather and resolve this situation." Her eyes widened. "You're asking me to pretend to be engaged to you?" "Yes," he replied, his voice steady. "You're already part of Ji-Hoon's life, and I trust you more than anyone else right now." Ji-Min took a step back, her mind reeling. "This is crazy. I'm just his nanny, No one will believe this. They will, Eun-Woo countered, his tone firm. I'll handle the logistics. I just need you to say yes. Ji-Min hesitated, her hands trembling slightly. The stakes felt impossibly high, but the sincerity in Eun-Woo's eyes stopped her from refusing outright. Fine, she said finally, her voice trembling. But only for Ji-Hoon. The announcement of their engagement sent shockwaves through Seoul's elite. Gossip buzzed about the mysterious nanny-turned-fiancé, with many speculating about her intentions. Hae-ri, in particular, was less than pleased. On the day Ji-Min was introduced to Oh Byung-chul, the tension in the air was palpable. The elder Cha sat in his high-backed chair, his piercing gaze assessing her from the moment she entered. So, this is the woman you've chosen to marry? Byung-chul said, his voice dripping with skepticism. Ji-Min bowed politely, her heart pounding. It's an honor to meet you, Mr. Cha. Byung-chul's sharp eyes narrowed, but before he could speak further, Eun-Woo stepped forward. This is my decision, and I expect it to be respected, he said, his tone leaving no room for debate. The days that followed were a whirlwind of orchestrated appearances and carefully planned events. Ji-Min found herself thrust into a world of glitzy parties and formal dinners, every detail scrutinized by the public and Eun-Woo's inner circle. At one such event, Ji-Min wore an elegant navy blue gown that hugged her figure gracefully, while Eun-Woo stood beside her in a tailored black suit. They posed for photos, their hands clasped as if naturally affectionate. You look beautiful, Eun-Woo murmured, his voice so low it was almost drowned out by the chatter of the crowd. Ji-Min's cheeks flushed, and she replied with a playful smile. And you're not so bad yourself. Despite the rehearsed nature of their interactions, moments like these felt strangely genuine, leaving Ji-Min questioning her own emotions. But the challenges loomed large. Hae-ri, unwilling to accept defeat, began digging into Ji-Min's past, determined to uncover something that could derail the engagement. Meanwhile, Ji-Min struggled with her growing feelings for Eun-Woo, unsure whether their connection was real or simply the result of their charade. Each day brought new questions and higher stakes, and Ji-Min realized that their lives had become far more intertwined than she had ever imagined. The early days of their fake engagement were anything but smooth. Ji-Min and Eun-Woo found themselves rehearsing for appearances, posing for photos, and answering polite but probing questions from Seoul's elite. Yet, behind closed doors, their dynamic remained as fiery as ever. Can you move these papers? Ji-Min asked one morning, gesturing to the pile of documents Eun-Woo had scattered across the living room table. This is my temporary office, Eun-Woo replied without looking up, his tone clipped. Ji-Min crossed her arms, her patience thinning. And where am I supposed to sit with Ji-Hoon to work on his drawing? On the floor? Do whatever you need to, Eun-Woo said flatly, finally glancing at her with a hint of challenge in his eyes. Ji-Min clenched her fists, her frustration bubbling to the surface. You think you can control everything just because you have money and power? Don't start, Eun-Woo replied, his voice low, but the warning was clear. Don't start? Ji-Min took a step closer, her voice rising. I'm not here to be treated like an accessory, Mr. Cha. I have as much right to use this space as you do. Eun-Woo looked up fully now, surprised by her boldness. For a moment, their eyes locked, and Ji-Min refused to back down. It was rare for someone to challenge him, and though it irritated him, he found her defiance oddly captivating. Later that day, Ji-Min took Ji-Hoon to the garden for some fresh air. The boy seemed more at ease these days, laughing as he chased a butterfly near the flower beds. Let's go to the swing, Ji-Min encouraged, holding his hand as they walked toward the small wooden structure under a cherry blossom tree. As Ji-Hoon played, Ji-Min found herself smiling, the tension from earlier melting away. But her peace was interrupted when she sensed someone watching. She turned to see Eun-Woo standing a few feet away, his arms crossed as he observed quietly. What are you doing here? She asked, surprised. I came to check on Ji-Hoon, he replied simply, though the way his eyes lingered on her suggested otherwise. Later, as Ji-Min chased Ji-Hoon through the garden, she stumbled over a small rock and fell onto the grass. Her startled yelp was quickly replaced by laughter as Ji-Hoon pointed and giggled. Eun-Woo was at her side in moments, his expression a mix of concern and amusement. "Are you hurt?" he asked, extending a hand to help her up. "I'm fine," Ji-Min said, brushing off her jeans. "Just a little fall." As she took his hand, their eyes met, and for a moment, time seemed to pause. Ji-Min felt her heart skip a beat, and judging by the flicker of something unspoken in Eun-Woo's gaze, she wasn't alone. That evening, tension flared again, but in a very different way. Eun-Woo had returned from work visibly stressed, the weight of a failed negotiation clouding his mood. Ji-Min, sensing his frustration, cautiously approached him in the library. "Are you all right?" she asked softly. "This has nothing to do with you," he replied tersely, not looking up. Ji-Min frowned, but didn't retreat. "You don't have to pretend everything is fine. Everyone needs help sometimes." Eun-Woo let out a bitter laugh, finally meeting her gaze. "And what would you know about pressure, Ji-Min? Do you have any idea what it's like to carry the weight of an entire family on your shoulders?" Her frustration mirrored his as she stepped closer. "You're right. I don't know what it's like to manage millions or run a company, but I do know what it feels like to lose everything and still find the strength to keep going. Ji-Hoon needs you to find that strength too." Her words seemed to pierce through his defenses. Eun-Woo stared at her, the fire in his eyes dimming to something softer, something vulnerable. The next morning, Eun-Woo joined Ji-Min and Ji-Hoon for breakfast, a rare occurrence. As Ji-Hoon chatted excitedly about his garden adventures, Eun-Woo found himself smiling, the boy's laughter infectious. "You're good with him," Eun-Woo said quietly to Ji-Min when Ji-Hoon ran off to play. Ji-Min looked up, startled by the rare compliment. "He's an amazing kid. He just needs love and patience." Eun-Woo nodded, his expression contemplative. "Thank you for everything you're doing." Their interactions began to shift in small but meaningful ways. Eun-Woo started staying longer during Ji-Hoon's playtime, and Ji-Min noticed his gaze lingering on her more often. One night, as they returned from an event, Ji-Min stumbled slightly on the mansion steps. Eun-Woo caught her arm, steadying her with ease. "Careful," he said, his voice tinged with unexpected concern. Ji-Min looked up at him, her cheeks flushing. "Thanks," she murmured. As their eyes met again, the growing warmth between them became impossible to ignore. The morning was deceptively calm in the Cha mansion, but the air felt heavy with unspoken tension. Ji-Min was in the garden with Ji-Hoon, helping him water the flowers they had planted together. The boy giggled as the water splashed over the petals, his face glowing with a happiness that Ji-Min had worked so hard to nurture. "Make sure to water this one," she said, pointing to a small sprout. "It's your special flower, remember?" Ji-Hoon nodded enthusiastically, gripping the watering can with both hands. He looked up at Ji-Min and asked with a small voice, "You're staying here forever, right?" Ji-Min froze for a moment, the weight of his question settling in her chest. She knelt down to his level and gently ruffled his hair. "I'll stay as long as you need me," she promised, her voice soft but firm. Inside the mansion, Eun-Woo sat in his study, staring at a file that Seo Hye-ri had dropped on his desk earlier that morning. The words on the page seemed to blur as he read them over and over again. Kang Ji-Min, 28 years old, involved in a legal dispute following the bankruptcy of her family's company, accused of financial negligence, though the case was dismissed due to lack of evidence. Eun-Woo's grip tightened on the file, his mind racing. Why hadn't she told him? He had trusted her, even allowed her into Ji-Hoon's life. "Why are you showing me this?" he had asked Hye-ri earlier, his voice sharp. "She's hiding things, Eun-Woo," Hye-ri had replied coolly. You should know who you're dealing with. Now, sitting alone in the dimly lit room, he felt a storm brewing inside him. That evening, Ji-Min was preparing dinner in the kitchen when Eun-Woo entered. His presence was commanding, as always, but there was an edge to his expression that immediately put her on alert. "Can we talk?" he said, his voice clipped. Ji-Min turned to face him, drying her hands with a towel. "Of course. What's wrong?" Eun-Woo placed the file on the counter between them, his eyes locking onto hers. "You want to explain this?" Ji-Min picked up the file, her heart sinking as she skimmed its contents. Her hands trembled slightly as she put it down. "Where did you get this?" "That doesn't matter," he replied, his tone cold. "Why didn't you tell me?" Ji-Min took a deep breath, struggling to steady herself. "Because it doesn't define who I am. That was a mistake from my past, something I had no control over." "You didn't think I deserved to know?" Eun-Woo pressed, his voice rising slightly. "I didn't want you to judge me for something I didn't do," Ji-Min replied, her voice firm despite the tears welling in her eyes. "But it seems I was wrong about that." Eun-Woo said nothing, his gaze unreadable. For the first time, Ji-Min felt truly out of place in the mansion. That night, Ji-Min packed a small bag, her mind swirling with emotions. She had given so much to Ji-Hoon, and now, it felt like everything was falling apart. As she walked down the grand staircase with her bag in hand, she found Eun-Woo waiting by the door. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice quiet but tense. "I'm leaving," she said, gripping the strap of her bag tightly. "This is too complicated." "And Ji-Hoon?" he asked, stepping closer. "You're just going to abandon him?" Ji-Min's heart ached at the mention of Ji-Hoon. "I would never abandon him," she said, her voice breaking. "But he needs stability, and I can't give him that if you don't trust me." Ji-Min stepped out into the rain, her bag in one hand as she walked toward the waiting taxi. The light drizzle soaked her coat, and she felt the weight of the mansion behind her like a shadow. Eun-Woo stood in the doorway watching her leave. His hands were clenched into fists, and his jaw tightened as he fought the urge to call her back. For the first time in years, he felt powerless. In the taxi, Ji-Min stared out at the city lights blurred by the rain. Tears rolled down her cheeks as she clutched her bag, her heart breaking not just for herself, but for Ji-Hoon and the bond they had built. Back in the mansion, Ji-Hoon woke up in the middle of the night and padded down the hallway in search of Ji-Min. When he couldn't find her, he ran to Eun-Woo's room, knocking frantically. "Where's Ji-Min?" Ji-Hoon asked, his voice full of panic. Eun-Woo knelt down and pulled the boy into his arms. She had to leave, but I'll bring her back, he promised, though he wasn't sure how he would do it. As Ji-Hoon cried in his arms, Eun-Woo realized the full weight of his mistake. Days passed, but the mansion felt emptier without Ji-Min. The usual laughter of Ji-Hoon was replaced by silence, and Eun-Woo found himself increasingly distracted at work. Even the most important meetings seemed unimportant compared to the ache in his chest. "You need to bring her back," Seo Hye-ri said bluntly during a rare visit. She sipped her coffee with an air of indifference, but her eyes betrayed a hint of concern. "Ji-Hoon won't last much longer like this, and neither will you." Eun-Woo frowned, her words cutting deeper than he cared to admit. "I don't even know if she'll listen to me," he replied, his tone uncharacteristically uncertain. "Then make her listen," Hye-ri said simply. "You're a CEO, Cha Eun-Woo. Start acting like one." That evening, Eun-Woo sat in Ji-Hoon's room, watching the boy sleep. His tiny hand clutched the stuffed bunny Ji-Min had given him, and his tear-streaked face was pressed against the pillow. "I'll bring her back," Eun-Woo whispered, more to himself than to Ji-Hoon. "I promise." The next morning, Eun-Woo called his assistant to track Ji-Min down. It didn't take long. She was staying in a modest boarding house on the outskirts of the city. As rain fell lightly against the car windows, Eun-Woo stared out at the gray skyline, his heart pounding as the taxi approached the boarding house. For a man who commanded boardrooms without hesitation, the thought of facing Ji-Min filled him with a rare and unfamiliar anxiety. Inside her small room, Ji-Min sat cross-legged on the bed, flipping through a children's book she had planned to read to Ji-Hoon. The quiet hum of rain outside was her only companion, until a sharp knock at the door broke the silence. She hesitated, her heart racing. When she opened the door, she found Eun-Woo standing there, drenched from head to toe. His black hair was slick against his forehead, and his white shirt clung to his frame, soaked through from the rain. "Can we talk?" he asked, his voice low and almost pleading. Ji-Min stepped aside reluctantly, allowing him into the small, warmly lit room. "What are you doing here?" Ji-Min asked, crossing her arms as she stood by the window. "I came to apologize," Eun-Woo began, his tone uncharacteristically soft. "And to ask you to come back." Ji-Min's eyes narrowed. "You accused me of hiding things. You didn't trust me. Why should I come back now?" Eun-Woo ran a hand through his wet hair, searching for the right words. "Because I was wrong," he admitted. "I let fear and doubt cloud my judgment. But Ji-Min, I need you. Ji-Hoon needs you. We're not the same without you." Ji-Min's resolve wavered, but she wasn't ready to give in. "You think you can just say that and fix everything?" "No," Eun-Woo said, stepping closer. "But I'm willing to try, if you'll let me." The vulnerability in his voice made Ji-Min's breath catch. She looked away, unsure of how to respond. "I've spent my whole life building walls to protect myself," he continued, his voice trembling slightly. "But you—" He paused, struggling for control. "You showed me that it's okay to care, to feel. Please, Ji-Min, come back." Tears welled in Ji-Min's eyes as she processed his words. Slowly, she lowered her gaze and whispered, "This won't be easy." "I know," Eun-Woo replied, his tone steady. "But I'm willing to fight for this. For us." He extended his hand, waiting. Ji-Min hesitated for a moment before placing her hand in his. "Okay," she said softly, her voice breaking. "But only if we do this together." Eun-Woo nodded, pulling her into a tight embrace. Ji-Min felt the warmth of his arms around her and realized that despite everything, she had missed this, the feeling of being wanted and needed. The next day, Eun-Woo brought Ji-Min back to the mansion. When Ji-Hoon saw her step through the door, his face lit up with pure joy. "Ji-Min!" he cried, running into her arms. She knelt down, hugging him tightly. "I promised, didn't I?" she said, smiling through her tears. Eun-Woo watched the scene from a distance, a small smile playing on his lips. For the first time in years, the mansion felt like a home. The Cha mansion was unusually quiet that morning, save for the sound of birds chirping outside the windows. Ji-Min sat on a wooden bench in the garden, her eyes following Ji-Hoon as he played with his stuffed bunny near the flower beds. The soft sunlight filtered through the trees, casting a warm glow on her delicate features. Her wavy brown hair fell loosely over her shoulders, and the gentle breeze carried the faint scent of blooming flowers. Despite the serene setting, her thoughts were a whirlwind. "Lost in thought again?" Eun-Woo's voice broke the silence, pulling her from her reverie. Ji-Min turned to see him approaching, his steps light but purposeful. He wore a light blue shirt with the sleeves rolled up, a rare departure from his usual formal attire. She offered a small smile. "I was just thinking about how much things have changed." Eun-Woo stopped a few feet away, his hands casually tucked into his pockets. His gaze shifted to Ji-Hoon, who was now stacking small stones to create a makeshift castle. "He's laughing more," Eun-Woo observed, his voice softer than usual. "That's all him," Ji-Min said, pride evident in her tone. "He's so strong." "You've been a big part of that," Eun-Woo replied, meeting her eyes. "And I don't think I've said it enough, but thank you." Ji-Min looked away, her cheeks flushing slightly. It's what anyone would do. No, Eun-Woo said firmly. Not anyone. A comfortable silence settled between them as they watched Ji-Hoon play. The boys' laughter rang through the garden, a sound that seemed to lift the weight of the world from Eun-Woo's shoulders. You're not what I expected, he admitted after a moment, his voice thoughtful. Ji-Min raised an eyebrow, a hint of a smile tugging at her lips. Is that a compliment? It is, he said, his tone earnest. You've brought something into this house that I didn't realize was missing. You've brought life. Her heart skipped a beat at his words, but she quickly masked her reaction. You're getting better at this whole emotional honesty thing, Mr. Cha, she teased lightly. Eun-Woo chuckled, shaking his head. Don't get used to it. That evening, Eun-Woo called Ji-Min to the library. She hesitated at the door, unsure of what to expect. Inside, the room was softly lit by a lamp on the desk. Eun-Woo stood near the window, holding a small velvet box in his hand. When he turned to face her, his expression was unusually vulnerable. I wanted to give you this, he said, stepping closer and opening the box to reveal a simple yet elegant ring. Ji-Min's breath hitched. Eun-Woo, what? He held up a hand to stop her. I know this started as a farce, but it doesn't feel like that anymore. At least, not for me. Her heart raced as he continued. You've changed everything, Ji-Min. You've shown me what it means to care for someone, to trust someone. I don't want this to end when the world stops watching. Eun-Woo took a deep breath, his voice steady, but filled with emotion. Will you marry me? Not because we have to, but because I want you by my side. For real this time. Ji-Min stared at him, her eyes glistening with tears. Eun-Woo, He waited, his gaze unwavering. Finally, she smiled through her tears and whispered, Yes. The next morning, Ji-Hoon ran into the garden, his tiny arms flailing excitedly. Ji-Min! Uncle Eun-Woo told me you're staying forever. Ji-Min laughed, kneeling to scoop him into her arms. That's right. Forever and ever. Eun-Woo watched from the doorway, his heart full as he observed the two people who had transformed his life. For the first time in a long while, the future didn't feel so daunting. The soft hum of music filled the air as the guests rose from their seats. The garden was a masterpiece of delicate white flowers, twinkling lights strung between trees, and an elegant aisle lined with petals. At the end of it stood Cha Eun-Woo, dressed in a perfectly tailored black tuxedo. His expression was calm, but his dark eyes betrayed a quiet intensity. As the music swelled, all heads turned. Ji-Min appeared at the edge of the aisle, her wavy brown hair cascading gently down her back. She wore a simple yet breathtaking wedding dress, with intricate lace detailing on the bodice and a flowing skirt that caught the light with every step. Her hands trembled slightly as she clutched the bouquet, but her expression was serene. As she moved closer, her gaze locked with Eun-Woo's, and the world around them seemed to disappear. Ji-Hoon, dressed in a miniature tuxedo, stood beside Eun-Woo, holding a small pillow with their rings. The boy's face lit up with excitement when Ji-Min reached the altar. You look so pretty, Ji-Min, he exclaimed, earning soft laughter from the guests. Ji-Min bent down to hug him before stepping beside Eun-Woo. Her cheeks flushed as she met Eun-Woo's intense gaze. You clean up nicely, she whispered teasingly. Eun-Woo allowed a rare smile to grace his lips. So do you. The ceremony was intimate and heartfelt. When it was time for their vows, Eun-Woo took Ji-Min's hands in his voice steady yet laced with emotion. Ji-Min, he began, you came into my life when everything felt cold and distant. You didn't just care for Ji-Hoon. You cared for me in ways I didn't even realize I needed. Today, I promise to stand by you, to trust you, and to love you with everything I have." Tears glistened in Ji-Min's eyes as she smiled softly. When it was her turn, her voice was steady but full of feeling. "Eun-Woo, you showed me that even in the darkest times, there's room for light. You gave me a family when I had none, and today, I promise to stand by your side as we build a future together, with love, patience, and strength." After the ceremony, Ji-Hoon was the first to run up and hug them both. "We're a family now, right?" he asked, his bright eyes darting between them. "Yes, we are," Ji-Min said, crouching to his level and pulling him into a tight embrace. Eun-Woo knelt beside her, placing a hand on Ji-Hoon's shoulder. "Forever," he said, his deep voice filled with sincerity. The reception was filled with warmth and laughter. Ji-Min, still in her elegant gown, moved through the crowd with ease, thanking guests and sharing smiles. Eun-Woo stayed close, his hand often brushing against hers, as though he couldn't bear to be apart for too long. At one point, Ji-Min noticed him standing alone, gazing at her from across the room. When their eyes met, he raised a glass slightly in her direction, his expression soft and filled with pride. Blushing, she made her way over to him. "Are you enjoying the party?" she teased. "It's not the party I'm enjoying," he replied smoothly, offering her a hand. As the night wore on, Ji-Hoon fell asleep in Ji-Min's lap, his tiny tuxedo slightly rumpled. Eun-Woo sat beside them, his arm draped casually over Ji-Min's shoulders. "You've changed everything," he murmured, looking at her with a mixture of gratitude and awe. Ji-Min smiled, leaning into his embrace. "So have you." The soft glow of lanterns illuminated their faces as they sat there, the weight of their past struggles replaced by a sense of peace and belonging. The sound of gentle waves echoed along the shore, creating a peaceful rhythm against the golden sands. Ji-Min sat cross-legged on a large beach towel, her hair dancing in the soft ocean breeze. She wore a light sundress in pastel tones, her gaze fixed lovingly on the two children playing nearby. Ji-Hoon, now 6, was carefully building a sandcastle, his small hands diligently patting down the towers. Beside him was a baby girl with dark, wispy hair. She giggled as she reached out to grab handfuls of sand, occasionally tipping over in her excitement. "Careful with your sister, Ji-Hoon," Ji-Min called out with a laugh, though her voice carried a motherly warmth. "I got her, Mom," Ji-Hoon replied proudly, gently guiding the baby's hand to add to his sandcastle. From behind her, Eun-Woo approached, carrying a tray with drinks and snacks. His white linen shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, and his sleeves were casually rolled up. His dark hair was slightly tousled, and he looked more relaxed than ever before. "You should be resting," he said, setting the tray down and sitting beside her. Ji-Min smiled, leaning into him. "And miss this?" "Never." Eun-Woo wrapped an arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. Together, they watched their children, the soft sounds of their laughter mixing with the soothing crash of the waves. As the sun dipped lower on the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, Ji-Hoon ran toward them, carrying a small shell in his hand. "Look, Uncle Eun-Woo, I found a special one." Eun-Woo took the shell, examining it with exaggerated seriousness. "A true masterpiece," he said, handing it back. Ji-Hoon grinned and ran back to his sister, who was clapping her hands excitedly. Ji-Min laughed softly. "They're so happy." "They have you to thank for that," Eun-Woo said, his voice low. "You gave us a family, Ji-Min. You made all of this possible." She turned to face him, her eyes shining. "We built this together," she replied. For a moment they simply gazed at each other, the unspoken emotions filling the space between them. Then Eun-Woo leaned in, pressing a soft kiss to her forehead. "Forever," he said, echoing the promise they had made on their wedding day. "Forever," Ji-Min repeated, her heart full. As the sun finally sank below the horizon, Their family sat together on the beach, the baby nestled in Ji-Min's arms, and Ji-Hoon leaning against Eun-Woo. The world felt vast and endless, but in that moment, they needed nothing more than each other.